I'd like to welcome you all for coming to this second event in the Socialist Speaker Series put on by your local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. This presentation is being recorded by the Missoula Community Access Television as a part of a media assistance grant donated to our organization by MCAT. I'd like you all to welcome former professor at UM, Clem Work. Clem began his journalism career working for daily newspapers in 1967 in Southern California and Denver. He obtained a law degree and was admitted to the California Bar in 1975. He was a deputy director of the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of Press in Washington, D.C. from 1980 to 1983. He then went to work for the U.S. News and World Report as a senior editor. In 1990, Work joined the faculty of the University of Montana School of Journalism, where he taught media law, editing, and headed the graduate program. He and his family lived in Kumamoto, Japan in 1995 on a faculty exchange. His book, Darkest Before Dawn, Sedition and Free Speech in the American West, was published by the University of New Mexico Press in August of 2005. The book led to gubernatorial pardons for 78 World War I sedition prisoners in Montana in 2006. In 2008, he co-produced a documentary film titled Jailed for Their Words, How Free Speech Died in Wartime America. Today, Montana textbooks reflect Work's unearthing of this dark chapter in the state's history. Work retired from UM in 2014. He has since been engaged with the growing refugee and immigrant community here in Missoula. He has been president of the board and supporter of Soft Landings Missoula. He volunteers twice a week as an ESL teacher at Missoula Public Schools Lifelong Learning Centers. And now I'd like to turn it over to Clem.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. My mission today is to briefly trace the rise and fall of socialism in the 20th century in Montana, but my focus will be on why and how its political power rapidly declined right at and after the end of World War I, a little more than a century ago. In particular, I will look at how the Socialist Party's opposition to U.S. entry in the war and the mania surrounding that U.S. entry, along with that of its frenemy, the IWW, led to all sorts of crackdowns, including harsh laws and prosecutions. But I will also attempt to show that as the pendulum of history swung back again, those cruel excesses actually fueled the development of the modern First Amendment freedom of expression. So my aim is, I think, quite a bit broader than the title of this, but bear with me, I have a lot of ground to cover. So socialism, as we all know, was a reaction to many of the economic ills of the era that, in fact, are issues that resonate today, and later we might have a discussion about some of those similarities and differences. So created in 1901, the Socialist Party of America's primary goal was, of course, the collectivization of the means of production. That was the primary plank in their platform. Anybody want to, or you may know, what some of the other planks in the Socialist Party's original platform were? Pretty basic. Anybody want to venture a guess? Work hours, paid leave, universal education, health care. In fact, I'll just read you what some of those were: health, employment, and old age insurance, public industries, free public education, at least K-12, equal civil and political rights for men and women, and political reform such as initiatives, referendums, and proportional representation. So things like that were pretty basic planks, pretty basic ideas, most of which we enjoy today. So there wasn't anything completely revolutionary about those, but of course that first one, the collectivization plank was the one that was, I would say, was the most revolutionary. Anyway, it was a political response to industrialism of the time, the evils of trusts, exploitation, corruption, the growing power of bankers, railroad barons, land speculators, and dismissive, contemptuous, intransigent bosses and owners, many of whom were absentee owners based on the East Coast. A typical statement by one of those bosses, Copper King William Clark, famously said, "I will flood the mines and not raise a pound of copper before I will recognize those anarchist leaders of the Union." Well, that was a typical statement that he and others made in one form or another. So here was a labor force plagued by these evils that was anxious, irritable, and ready to act. And in the western part of the U.S. particularly was a hotbed of radical activity because the extractive industries that were primarily in the West were really booming at the time, mining, agriculture, timber, and fishing as well. And so the growing number of workers who were being employed and oppressed in these jobs wanted primarily better security, better working conditions, clean government, superior public services. Some of the things we just talked about in the platform of the Socialist Party, but what they were particularly interested in was what was also referred to as gas, water, and sewer socialism. In other words, practical rather than Marxist ideology. Yes, the Socialist Party definitely attracted people who were interested in the ideology and the development and the process of ideological advancement, but most of the workers, at least in the West, and I would say beyond that, were interested in curing or at least improving dangerous working conditions. They were interested in improving some way their hopes of advancement while doing wage work, and they were concerned about the rapid socioeconomic changes that were affecting their lives. Socialists in the West were also described as a somewhat unsophisticated bunch. As a miner in Kingman, Arizona, told a comrade from New York, being a socialist had nothing to do with reading or going to lectures. All one had to know was that one was being robbed. But it was a heterogeneous movement. There were a lot of different kinds of people involved in the movement. Immigrants, trade unionists, social gospel ministers, professionals, urban reformers, small business persons, farmers, middle class intellectuals, socially conscious millionaires, yes, you heard that, socially conscious millionaires, and urban reformers and feminists, among other groups that were interested in socialism. So within the Socialist Party, in general, there was a split. And they can be characterized in different ways. And of course there were other splits, but the primary ideological split was between the Reds and the Yellows. Okay, well the Yellows, which were also known as Socialists, were characterized as having a hunger for respectability, an inclination to work for the utopian objective gradually through the political process, and a willingness to make alliances with or work through craft unions and go to the public with platforms featuring reforms. So those were the Socialists. Those on the left were the Reds, also known as the Impossibilists, who wanted to emphasize the messages of class conflict, worker solidarity, and the need for revolutionary action. And this split characterized the Socialist Party from the beginning to the end. So in Montana, socialists enjoyed really what you might characterize as exponential growth from the beginning. Although the numbers aren't great, you have to look at them in relation to the population of Montana. But in 1904, there were at least 400 members. By 1908, that had doubled. By 1912, that had probably doubled again. So it was a significant number of people who were members. And socialist names began appearing on the ballot irregularly. In 1902, actually, the state's first socialist candidate, George Sproul, ran for Congress. He lost, but he got 3,000 votes. That was pretty good. And then in 1904, cigar maker John Franke was elected the mayor of Anaconda with 46% of the vote, along with a socialist treasurer, police chief, and I think 2 or 3 council members. One of the members of the party in Anaconda at the time said of that victory, "We buried the old parties, the jackass and the elephant, after having killed them good with cannonballs of an aroused public opinion, and as we lowered their carcasses into the grave of political oblivion and sealed them tight, the band played the Marseillaise while the comrades shouted cheers of victory." Woo! They don't write stuff like that anymore. Unfortunately for Franke, the Anaconda Company, handed out pink slips to all perceived supporters of Franke, and he lost badly in the next election. But the yellows and the reds in Montana continued to sort of wrestle for control. The reds came to be led by Lewis Duncan, who was also the elected twice as the mayor of Butte in 1911 and 1913, until he was actually ousted from office in 1914. Lewis Duncan was also known as the Eugene Debs of Montana, and I will get into Eugene later on. The yellows were led by a woman named Ida Crouch Hazlitt, who was also the editor of the Montana News. And the newspaper itself was the focus of an internecine warfare between the yellows and the reds, with the reds under Duncan seizing control of the Montana News, and Hazlitt walking away disgruntled. But she was a woman who I would say was a socialist with her hair on fire. She was a agitator, organizer, party candidate, newspaper reporter, and editor. Traveled around and worked in Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, and wrote and reported on the socialist movement, and was one of the most persistent critics of the Reds, the more radical group. Anyway, she was a considerable force within the party. And speaking of the Montana News, the socialist paper that actually had originated in Lewistown, but then was moved to Helena, an important aspect of socialist work was the press and associated things like that. Newspapers, handbills, party literature, all of that was considered to be a very important part of the socialist work and outreach. And in the U.S., socialists could point with pride at some point to the fact that there were more than 300 English and foreign language socialist periodicals. Of course, in a day when there were thousands of periodicals. Probably the most influential of those was a newspaper that was published in Kansas. Anybody know the name of that? It was called the Appeal to Reason, which had at its peak 700,000 subscribers. That's a lot of subscribers even by later standards. And it had thousands of distributors, people who were enthusiastic about the newspaper and its message. And it was an army of distributors, in fact, called the Appeal Army. And it was through that magazine or publication that a lot of news and newsletters and various ideas were promulgated. So in addition to the internecine warfare that went on in Montana, across the country, not just in Montana, socialism always had to deal with competition from unions and from political parties, both left and right. So they were always struggling to either differentiate themselves from or align themselves with different groups that were advocating contemporary progressive causes, including workers' rights, the anti-war movement, which I'll get into a lot later, temperance and women's suffrage. And I've already alluded to the sort of alternating courtship dance or battle between the Socialist Party and the IWW, which comes along in 1905. So socialists faced numerous political challenges from other parties, not only the Democratic and Republican parties, but also on the left, anarchists, syndicalists, communists, Farmer Labor Party activists, various other groups that they were constantly sort of either warding off or trying to figure out a way to join forces with. So Melvin Dubofsky, who is a well-known historian of the radical movements of the time, analyzed this issue that the socialists had. He said the greatest dilemma for U.S. socialists remained how to convert the majority of trade unionists and workers to their cause. Unlike continental Europe, where socialist parties and trade unions emerged together and where socialists often birthed unions, in the United States, nearly all of the affiliates of the AFL and the largest unaffiliated unions were founded before the birth of the Socialist Party. So unlike Europe, where the socialist movement was instrumental in winning franchise rights for workers, in the US, adult male workers obtained the right to vote prior to the emergence of socialism and developed loyalties to one of the two major parties. So that was always a hurdle for the Socialist Party to overcome. Another observer, a German economist named Werner Sombart, believed that U.S. socialists faced an uphill battle because the working class of the United States was much more conservative than in European countries, particularly among German workers. And he thought that the cause of the workers' conservatism was affluence or relative affluence. And he said, quote, all socialist utopias come to nothing on reefs of roast beef and apple pie. Speaking of which, Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers, of course, was the leader of the AFL for many years and represented the yellow side of socialism, that is, the socialists, the people who wanted to get along with or join forces with the existing parties and businesses and so forth. And he maintained hold on the AFL from 1886 until 1924. So he was an important force, or in this case, you would say he was a counterforce who opposed the socialist agenda by basically wanting to co-opt that agenda and cooperate with unions and so forth. So I could continue to describe that, but basically, because of these challenges and the infighting that I referred to, by the time that the presidential elections in 1916 roll around, the party is already in disarray, many of its key issues having been co-opted or incorporated successfully into other social and political movements. So you can't count socialism dead yet, but it's definitely dying at this time. So in terms of lifespan, that's not a whole lot. You know, it's basically from 1901 to 1916. I had originally planned to talk more about the rich and colorful history of Butte mining, especially in the 19th century, but that would take a lecture by, at least one lecture more by itself. But I want to just sort of grossly summarize by saying that many thousands of miners toiled long hours in dangerous conditions underground, built community by taking care of each other instead of relying on owners who ignored them, harassed them, spied on them, cut wages, sicked troops on them, and profited greatly from them. That was basically what was going on in Butte among the miners, who at one point numbered close to 20,000. But to pick up the story of Butte at the end of the very end of the 19th century, in 1899, the major thing that happens is that Standard Oil buys the interests of the previous owners and becomes the Amalgamated Copper Company and crushes their last independent competitor, Augustus Hines, in 1903. And the reason that they did that was that in court cases, they were constantly being stymied by judges who were very biased for Hines. There was a judge named William Clancy, a big, bushy, bearded, tobacco-chewing magistrate who would nod off on the bench only to wake up and proclaim, "The court finds for Mr. Hines." Well, at that time, there was no change of venue law that would allow a new judge, if the party to a lawsuit felt that the judge was biased against them. So that was the thing that the Amalgamated Copper Company closed its operations, shut down, to hell with the 20,000 workers, and then demanded that the state call a special session of the legislature to pass a change of venue law. The legislature caves, passes this law. This forces Hines to sell out. He goes back to New York, but before he does that, in a speech delivered on the steps of the Silver Bow County Courthouse before 10,000 angry, suddenly unemployed miners, Hines delivers a somewhat prophetic eulogy for that era. He says, "If they crush me today, they will crush you tomorrow. They will cut your wages and raise the tariff in the company stores on every bite you eat and every rag you wear. They will force you to dwell in Standard Oil houses while you live, and they will bury you in the Standard Oil coffins when you die." And of course, for wage workers for the Anaconda, that was pretty much what happened to them. In a waypoint along the way, in March of 1912, the company fired 500 miners who they labeled as socialists. And then in that December, they imposed the rustling card system, the blacklist system that screened workers by requiring them to answer questions about their union and political affiliations. And those deemed to be agitators were simply not called to work, a remarkably effective tactic. Another tactic being the detectives, the Pinkerton and other agency detectives that were hired and worked overtime to infiltrate, identify troublemakers, even provoke violence themselves, if possible, to weaken the unions from within. So by 1914, frustration had kind of reached a peak. Miners were being paid, guess how much a day? It was a little more than $1, but it was $3.50 a day, and it was the same wage as in 1878. So despite the fact that the price of copper had gone way up, miners were still being paid the same for more than 35 years. That frustration and anger at the Butte Miners Union for perceived collaboration with owners and so forth led to the dynamite destruction of the Miners Hall in Butte in 1914, after which the company announced that they would no longer recognize the legitimacy of the Western Federation of Miners, and that was the end of the era of the closed shop. Just a few years later came probably the greatest disaster in the history of Butte, the Granite Mountain mine disaster on June 8th of 1917. A group of men who had descended in an elevator to inspect an electrical cable that had frayed. While inspecting it, the assistant foreman accidentally touched his carbide lamp to the paraffin paper that was wrapped around the cable. It caught fire and just went from there through the tunnels and shafts and resulted in the deaths of 168 miners, which was the biggest loss, single event loss of life, but culminating many, many losses of lives in the mines. And I'm sure that some of you here have seen the monument to the speculator disaster in Butte on a hillside overlooking the former the site of the mine, and it's a very impressive monument. So 3 days after that disaster, a general strike erupted across the hill with demands for working conditions and safety, of course, being the key demand. So here's where the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, comes in. The IWW was founded in 1905. Its preamble famously said, "The working class and the employee class have nothing in common." They urged the formation of one big union, but by that phrase, the working class and the employing class have nothing in common, that kind of characterized their attitude. In your face, confrontation, direct action, absolute hatred of capitalism, but also nonviolence. Wobblies, as they were known, were proud of the fact that no wobbly had ever been convicted of an act of violence. Well, I'm not so sure that that was exactly the case, but they were proud of their nonviolence. So I want to introduce three main characters, three IWW characters. The first was William D. Big Bill Haywood, who was the leader of the IWW at the beginning. Born in Salt Lake, in 1869, he was more than 6 feet tall. He had a kind of an imposing appearance and sort of a sinister appearance because he had lost the sight of one eye in a childhood accident. He worked in the mines. He became secretary treasurer of the Western Federation of Miners at the age of 31. He not long after the IWW was founded in Chicago in 2005, he was kidnapped along with 2 other men by Idaho authorities who rushed him to Boise, Idaho to stand trial for the murder of Governor Frank Steunenberg on December 30th, 1905. A bomb planted in the governor's mailbox exploded and killed him. And he and his associates were tried and were defended by Clarence Darrow and acquitted. The book about that, called Big Trouble by Anthony Lucas, is probably the finest book that I have read about the political and social and labor climate of the time, and I highly recommend it. It's called Big Trouble. Anyway, Haywood sort of became an instant legend because of that trial. He went on to, of course, become a IWW leader. He was an advocate of general strikes, boycotts, even sabotage to achieve the labor's objectives, and kind of spread fear throughout the West as home to some of the most dangerous, or maybe dangerous-looking radicals in the country. And later on, he was convicted of violating the Espionage Act and fled the country. Anyway, that was Big Bill Haywood. Second character, more closely associated with Missoula, was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She came originally from Massachusetts. Her parents were socialists. She rejected the stodgy socialism of her parents, as any young person would reject the ideology of their parents. As did also an associate or a contemporary of hers at the time, Ralph Chaplin, who said of socialist politicians, "Too many of them look like frustrated old businessmen or foxy young lawyers. Too many of them carried briefcases or bulged too comfortably at the waistline to suit me. What are such petty bourgeois characters doing in a revolutionary proletarian movement?" Well, that was his opinion. Anyway, Gurley, as she was known, is spelled Gurley, but that's how she was known. At 19, she was already a seasoned activist and speaker. And at 19 and pregnant, although she probably didn't know it, because she was about 6 weeks along at the time, she shows up in Missoula to organize against the outrageously unfair practices of employment agencies who had perfected this scheme of charging workers fees for being hired, for the privilege of being hired, I would say. And then the company would turn around and fire them. And this was a circular process that somebody once described as looking exactly like perpetual motion, or that they invented perpetual motion. Anyway, it was a big scam that ripped off the workers, and Flynn decided that she would use that grievance to organize the IWW. So she came to Missoula, which at that time had an ordinance against public speaking. Unless you got a permit, and of course you had to be the right kind of person to get a permit. Okay, so what they did, and this was not a tactic that she invented but copied, that had been used in other places, but not that long before. they deliberately got up one by one and spoke and got themselves arrested so that they could be taken to jail. Flynn says, just prior to that, we sent out a call to all footloose rebels to come at once to defend the Bill of Rights. So as one speaker was arrested, another took his place, deliberately filled the jail with wobblies. They were released on bail or whatever. Meanwhile, this was costing the city money to feed them and pay for jailers and so on. Another group of wobblies comes in, fills the jail. The city caves and repeals the speaking ban. Great tactic, huh? Okay, they take it to Spokane next, which is a much more violent and long-winded effort by free speech fight. Flynn Gurley filed daily reports actually with the Appeal to Reason. And after actually several people had died, the city did back down after 5 months and revoked the licenses of the fraudulent employers that Gurley was railing against. And agencies and the city passed more tolerant speech ordinances. So having sort of perfected the technique, the Wobblies took this technique all across the West, and there were more than 30 free speech fights in the next few years in the Seattle area, in Oregon, and in California, a particularly violent one in San Diego. And what that did was to create two things that the Wobblies wanted: publicity and worker dues, okay, membership dues, to bolster the pocketbook of the IWW. And curiously, I found they weren't particularly interested ideologically in the freedom of speech, let's say as an abstract principle. They were using it as a means of attracting attention to themselves. Not that they were inimical, they were not hostile to the idea of free speech at all, but that wasn't their primary motivation. Their primary motivation was to attract people to the IWW, and it worked to a certain extent, but the problem with IWW membership was that people would join and then they would leave, and then they would join and then they would leave. So it had a very fluid membership. Now would be a good time to break out an IWW song, which I will not do, but just one verse, and sorry I don't know the tune to this, but I'll just read the words. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made. So because of their in-your-face stance, they made plenty of enemies really fast. Quickly, IWW was nicknamed I Won't Works. They seemed to kind of revel in the way that they were treated. So the third person I want to introduce, who was also in Missoula for the free speech fight, was Frank Little. He had been already an organizer for quite a few years. But I'm going to pick up the thread of the Granite Mountain fire after the fire when the workers went on strike. Little had been in Arizona and heard about this and vagged that hitchhiked on a train to come up to Missoula, walks up the Butte Hill on July 18th, about a month after the Granite Mountain fire, The U.S. had already entered the war. The Army was drafting young men for the fight. There was a growing anti-draft sentiment that was gaining ground in Butte. Why? For one thing, there were a lot of Irish here that hated the British. And also there were a lot of Germans, Serbs, Croats, Italians who were reluctant to be drafted, return to Europe, and perhaps fight their relatives who were on the other side. So Little starts giving speeches daily telling the miners that the war is a conflict that should be left to the capitalists who started it. Workers, he argued, had more in common with each other regardless of their nationality. He urges the workers to strike. He says, "Look the city daddies in the face and tell them to go to hell." And that was basically his attitude. At the same time, strikes had broken out also in Montana's other main extractive industry, in the timber industry. There was a widespread strike throughout the northwestern Montana. And shall we say, the establishment was wondering why the heck Little wasn't being arrested. Well, the reason was that the U.S. attorney at the time, Burton K. Wheeler, and the U.S. federal judge at the time, George Borquin, decided that, or agreed that under the existing law, they couldn't arrest Little. So, you know what happened. They took it, in fact, people took the law into their own hands. And in the middle of the night on August 1st, 6 men identifying themselves as officers abducted Little from his boarding room. They beat him, dragged him behind a car, and finally hung him from a train trestle on the city's edge, and nobody was ever convicted of his murder. Again, some of you may have visited his tombstone in Mountain View Cemetery in Butte, which famously is inscribed, "Slain by capitalist interests for organizing and inspiring his fellow man." Well, another person who was very inspiring in a somewhat different way was Eugene Debs, who I referred to earlier, also described as a social arsonist who goes around setting people on fire. So he brought his prophetic and intellectual intensity to his speeches and exuded an unshakable faith in the ability of the poorest and most despised people to change the world. He had a kind of a folksy attitude, folksy shtick to him. Came from Indiana, one of 10 children, organized railroad workers, founded the American Railway Union, which quickly grew to over 100,000 members. He was instrumental in the founding of the Socialist Party, and which by that time, in 1921 had grown to nearly a million voters. He ran for president 4 times. The greatest success in 1912, he received nearly 1 million votes, which was about 6% of the total. But in states in the Mountain West, including in Montana, he received more than 10% of the vote. So, in retrospect, Debs was reacting to enormous changes in American society. During and before the Civil War, the average factory had maybe 10 people. And the old idea, Lincoln's idea, maybe Benjamin Franklin's idea before that, was that any skilled workman could become self-employed, could open up his own workshop, manufacture whatever it was he manufactured, hire other apprentices to work for him, and they would in turn go out and become independent. Well, that whole idea went out the window with the coming of industrialization. So Debs thought that Americans were at the mercy of their employers, and he was right. And so in this new, hugely expanding industrial economy, the only way that you could restore the independence and the citizenship in the largest sense was to, through cooperation, building strong unions, electing working class members to public office, creating new kinds of institutions that drew on the collective powers of many individuals. So Debs, for years, crisscrossed the country for his presidential campaign and for other purposes, giving countless speeches about the need for socialism. As I said, he was folksy, sincere, ardent, and long-winded. He spoke typically for more than 2 hours, a length which I will try not to emulate. Then in June of 1918, after the U.S. had been at war for a year, and the Espionage Act, which I'll describe, had come into effect, he came to Canton, Ohio, to support some local socialists who were in jail for opposing the war. Gave a speech mostly about civil liberties, the necessity to protect civil liberties, but also outlined the traditional socialist opposition to a capitalist war. It was really only a couple of paragraphs in this speech that, in this case, was a short speech, only an hour. So I have asked his ideological heir to speak and give and render the words that made Debs particularly well known.
No mic on this one. Excerpt from the speech of 1918. They have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourself slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war, and strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. And here let me emphasize that the working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war, and they alone make peace. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die. You need at this time especially to know that you are fit for something better than slavery and cannon fodder. You need to know that you were not created to work and produce and impoverish yourself to enrich an idle exploiter. You need to know that you have a mind to improve, a soul to develop, and a manhood to sustain.
Thank you, Brennan. Well, there were federal agents in the audience writing down his words. And the Justice Department indicts Debs for violating the Espionage Act, which actually had nothing to do with espionage, but had everything to do with free expression, which you would think would be constitutionally guaranteed, but was not at the time. He goes to trial and is convicted, and in the spring of 1919, he is carted off to federal prison, ending up in the Atlanta Penitentiary with a 10-year sentence for having given one speech. He runs for president again from the prison. Eventually, his sentence, actually after 2 years, his sentence is commuted by President Warren Harding after Wilson had left office. So he only served about 2 years in the federal penitentiary, but it's a hard 2 years, and his health is broken. The Socialist Party's own health is, as I said, was broken by 1912, but the death knell, if you will, was its opposition to the war, the Espionage Act prosecutions, and other things that maybe didn't receive as much attention, like postal censorship. The post office was empowered to not permit the mailing of anything that was contrary to the stated policy of the United States, including the war. So anything that was anti-war would not be mailed. Well, in an age when mail and periodicals were the way of communicating, this was devastating to the socialists and to others. So there were those things. And then, of course, the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Bolsheviks, the flight of some socialists to the Communist Party, growing suspicion and paranoia about the Communist Party, the Red Scare, the first Red Scare in 1919, the Palmer raids, which were raids by the Attorney General against people who were suspected of being communists, and other forms of savage repression. All of those things combined basically stopped the Socialist Party dead in its tracks. However, there were some political victories. Victor Berger, a socialist, was elected as a representative. However, he was twice refused, the House of Representatives twice refused to seat him. Why? Simply because he was a socialist. Berger had also been editor of the Milwaukee Leader, but he had also been convicted under the Espionage Act and given 20 years. But his conviction was reversed in 1921, and he eventually reclaimed his seat in 1923. 2 years later, in New York State, two state legislators were refused their seats as assemblymen in New York City. And again, they protested, and eventually that sort of became a sort of a laughing matter, that people began to poke fun at the city government for having been afraid of socialists simply because they were socialists, and that was kind of the end of that movement to deny socialists their political rights, at least as elected candidates. I mentioned, of course, the huge event, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the birth of the Soviet Union, that many of the younger and more active American-born members, including people like John Reed, James Cannon, Max Eastman, they bolted the Socialist Party and fled to the Communist Party, further weakening the Socialist Party. Bolsheviks, of course, take the title of the Communist Party. They left the Communist Party just in the United States just grows by leaps and bounds. Many tens of thousands of members. Next event, the anarchist bombings of 1919 that maimed and killed a number of people, was the act that led to the raids by Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, which were intended to find these people and to arrest them, and not only arrest them and deport them. Imagine that, deport them. So by 1920, Hiram Johnson, the senator from California, said this: "The war has set back the people for a generation. They have bowed to 100 repressive acts. They have become slaves to the government. They are frightened at the excesses in Russia. They are docile and they will not recover from being so for many years. Again, a very prophetic statement that proved true, and it had a lot of truth to it. So as the early 20th century sees the Soviet Union expand through Eastern Europe, association of socialism or communism with authoritarianism takes hold, begins to spread, inspiring the first wave of the Red Scare in 1919, fears that socialists and communists would either infiltrate the government or overthrow the government completely. That leads, of course, eventually and ineluctably to Joe McCarthy, who starts in 1950 with his scare tactics and what we now, or some people refer to as the second Red Scare, that sort of decimates the Communist Party membership in the United States and drives others into hiding. And the Socialist Party, by that time, which has continued to bleed members, basically drops out of electoral politics altogether in 1950. After the 1952 election, when it gained no more than 100,000 votes. So for much of the 20th century, the attack on socialism as a concept was tied into the existence of the Soviet Union, which was, of course, regarded as a threat to national security. And by the time that the Cold War started, socialism and radicalism in general had been destroyed. How am I doing for time? Okay. So a little more about war hysteria and the Espionage Act of 1917. I haven't mentioned very much about the corrosive role of the press, both in Montana and across the country, except for the socialist press or any other radical press. The press was definitely in the pocket of the establishment. And I'm just going to read you a few quotes here that sort of typify the tenor, of newspaper editorializing. Tom Stout, editor of the Lewistown News-Democrat, he said this I think in 1918. "We are done with the days of a divided allegiance in this broad land of liberty. There can be but two classes of American citizens, patriots and traitors. Choose you the banner beneath which you will stand in this hour of trial." Will Campbell, the editor of the Helena Independent and the de facto head of the Montana Council of Defense, was a person who was especially venomous, who delighted in provocative harangues, and was quoted as having said, "Down at the bottom of the threatened trouble in Butte, the authorities will find Prussian money." This was said during the time of the First World War. "That and the usual riffraff of IWWs who, like hyenas, hang in the rear of an army to pick up what may be thrown aside." And the last quote is from James W. Gerard, the U.S. ambassador to Germany and son-in-law of Marcus Daly, who wrote in the New York Tribune, again during the war, "We should hog-tie every disloyal German American, feed every pacifist raw meat, and hang every traitor to a lamppost to ensure success in this war." So the typical editorial statements by newspapers, combined with an extraordinary effort of propaganda and influence and attitude influencing in an organization called the the Committee for Public Information. It was a group that was formed very shortly after the beginning of the U.S. entry into the war. It was headed by a progressive Denver newspaperman named George Creel, and its mission was to harness and to promote public enthusiasm and support for U.S. For the U.S. in the war, but it went way overboard and substituted aroused passion for political authority, spawned a hysterical brand of patriotism through propaganda, censorship, what we would call viewpoint discrimination. The CPI enlisted authors, illustrators, Hollywood. One of the films was The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin. Leaflets, ads, lesson plans, and one of my favorites, the 4-Minute Men. 4-Minute Men were people who were recruited to give pithy, simple speeches in favor of the war. And a lot of people volunteered to do that. And the fact that they could only speak for 4 minutes was probably an attraction. 1 million speeches, or 4-Minute Men gave 1 million speeches to 400 million people. Of course, some of those audiences were duplicated. All not only promoting enthusiastic support of the war, but what they did led to a climate of hysteria about the war. So how did that hysteria manifest itself in Montana? Well, people swore they saw airships over the Bitterroot, German airships over the Bitterroot. They swore they saw German, wireless stations in the woods. They swore that Germans had infected bee pollen with toxins so they wouldn't propagate, and various other things, all of which were patently untrue, but were believed by so many people. Have you ever heard of that before? And another manifestation of this hysteria was that in Lewistown, in Fergus County, they got so riled up about German textbooks that a group of people marched into the high school in Lewistown, swept all the German textbooks, and by the way, German language was the most spoken foreign language in Montana at the time, piled all of those German textbooks into the street, in a pile, and burned them. And made people that they suspected of sympathizing to kiss the flag. There were private loyalty organizations sprouting all over the place, such as the American Protective League, that took spying on neighbors to a new level. A socialist named Oscar Ameringer said in his memoir, those were the sweetless, wheatless, meatless, heatless, and perfectly brainless days when your fathers broke Beethoven's records, boycotted Wagner's music, burned German books, painted German Lutheran churches and Goethe's monument in Chicago the color of shell filling stations. In other words, yellow. So the Espionage Act of 1917, I'll read you just part of it. Whoever, when in the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation of military forces, or who shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty, or who shall willfully obstruct the recruitment or enlistment service of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of no more than $10,000 or more than 20 years. Any of that sound like espionage? No, but that was the Espionage Act. Almost 2,000 cases were brought in the United States under the Espionage Act. Half of them in the West, juries middle-class juries easily rendered convictions. Biased judges in many cases oversaw these cases. But ironically, the one state in which there were no convictions under the United States Espionage Act was Montana. Why? Because of the previously mentioned Burton K. Wheeler and George Borquin, who stood in the way, who said, this does not, the cases that that have been brought before us do not rise to the level of this statute, that we cannot, in good conscience, prosecute people for this. So, ironically, this was the only state in which there were no Espionage Act convictions, but there were convictions, which I'll get to in a minute under Montana law. But the biggest case under the Espionage Act was the trial of the IWW in 1918, including Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, many, many others, 96 defendants in all, presided over by Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Anybody ever heard of him in another context? Robbie? He was the commissioner of baseball after the Chicago Black Sox scandal. Anyway, Landis wasted no time just to hasten this case along. There were 10,000 counts in all against these 96 defendants. The jury took 45 minutes to affirm the convictions in all 10,000 counts, sending away Haywood and others for 20 years. And that's the reason that Haywood left the country. So there were plenty of convictions under the Espionage Act, but as I said, not in Montana, partly or mainly because of Wheeler and Borquin. Now, Borquin was a very kind of straight-laced guy, independent thinker, a loner by choice. When he dined, he pulled all the other chairs to the table so that nobody would sit next to him and start a conversation about a case or something. He was very Puritan in that sense. But he also had an interesting observation about patriotism. Like religion, patriotism is a virtue so indispensable and exalted, its excesses pass with little censure. But when it descends to fanaticism, it is of the reprehensible quality of the religion that incited the tortures of the Inquisition and the scaffolds of Salem, and is equally cruel and murderous. In its name, what crimes have been committed? In every age, it too furnishes its heresy hunters and its witch burners, and it too is a favorite mask for hypocrisy, assuming a virtue which it haveth not. So, in reaction to the frustration that was being felt in Montana by the establishment that nobody was being convicted under the Espionage Act, Governor Sam Stewart, who was a Democrat, encouraged the promulgation of a sedition law in Montana, what he called a mighty means of throttling the traitor and choking the traducer. So sedition is the illegal promotion of resistance in the government, against the government, usually in speech or writing. What is illegal depends on what the government thinks it is. The crime of sedition is alive and well in many countries today, and it was a tool of oppression used by the British monarchy for centuries. In the U.S., of course, sedition has been a crime enforced at various times. Most famously before these events was during the Adams administration, when the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were passed. And then again in 1940, the Smith Act, which criminalized membership in the Communist Party. So Montana was the first, but not the last, of the states to enforce a sedition law, and definitely was the state that enforced it most, I would say, viciously. But the heart of the bill was that anyone who during wartime criticizes the government or communicates an intent to incite resistance to the war effort is guilty of sedition. Well, you can depend on the newspapers to editorialize in the manner that you could depend on them to editorialize about. The Missoulian. We limit speech today that it may live free forever. Talk about Orwellian doublespeak. Whenever a free and self-governing people fights for more freedom, it must momentarily restrict its own liberties. But they are never lost. They are only laid aside where they can easily be reached. So, under this sedition law, about 200 arrests were made. 78 people were charged and convicted. 78 people were convicted. 41 people went to prison, 40 men and one woman. In my book and later in the Pardon Project that we did, we elicited the stories of many of these people, and I could go on for days, literally, talking about it. But I'll just give you a couple of short examples. A man named Ben Kahn was a Jewish liquor salesman whose territory, believe it or not, was Montana and Wyoming. So he had a big territory. One day he is in Red Lodge at the famous Pollard Hotel, or it's famous now. And he goes down to breakfast and encounters Mr. Pollard, and they get into a conversation. And at some point, Ben starts complaining about the wartime food regulations that have been put into effect to ration and so forth. And he says to Mr. Pollard, "These wartime regulations are a big joke." Well, Ben goes his round to his liquor store clients and comes back at noon for lunch and finds out that there is a warrant for his arrest. Mr. Pollard has notified the authorities, and they have come to arrest him for sedition, for saying that the wartime food regulations were a big joke. He is tried, he is convicted, and he is sentenced to 7 to 15 years in the penitentiary for that. Thomas Barans, a Missoula farmer with German heritage, boasts to somebody that the Germans are going to win the war. He is arrested, convicted by a jury that includes the Reverend John McLean. That name ring a bell to you? The minister in The River Runs Through It. So he was one of the jurors in Barans' case. And then one of my favorite ones was Martin Wenger. Martin Wenger came from Austria. He became a drover. A drover was a person who drove and commanded a long chain of oxen in what was then known as a freight train. Okay, and a person like that has to be a pretty burly guy, right? And he was. He was a big, strong guy. And the reason that we even know that was that we even have a photograph of him that was taken in Miles City by a famous photographer. Anyway, Martin was working as a drover. He was having a meal with some friends, and he too started talking about the war in some kind of a negative way. And he too is convicted. It turns out that Martin, one of the things he had done when he was a drover that he was sort of locally famous for was that he killed a bear with an axe. So he was watering his oxen at a river crossing, and a bear came up to his wagon, and he spotted the bear, and he didn't have a gun, but he had an axe, and he was a big burly guy, and he hit the bear over the head a couple of times and killed the bear with an axe. So that sort of promoted his legend as being this guy, who killed probably no other person in history, or maybe, but not very many people killed a bear with an axe. Anyway, here was this guy who just looked the picture of health, went to prison. 4 years later, he was released from prison, and his health was shot. He was toothless, and he died shortly after he was released from prison. So a man who, killed a bear with an axe became a toothless felon and died for the crime of having spoken out about the war. There are many others that I could go on about. One more that just involves basically the only two white-collar sedition defendants were William Dunn, who was the editor of the Butte Daily Bulletin, and his assistant, Bruce Smith. So remember Will Campbell, the editor of the Helena Independent that I talked about? Well, he had it out for Dunn. So what he did was, Campbell was in Helena, but he subscribed to the Butte Daily Bulletin. Why? So that he would be able to argue that he was affected by what the Butte Daily Bulletin was putting in its paper. In other words, to gain jurisdiction. But they still had a problem how to get Dunn from Butte, where they knew that no jury would ever convict him in Butte, to Helena. Well, that was easy. Kidnap him. They hustled him into a car, and they took him to Helena. They held him during his trial, and they convicted him of sedition. However, it was reversed in 1920 by the Montana Supreme Court. Why? Because the Supreme Court pointed out that Will Campbell was the only subscriber to the bulletin in Helena, and he had done so in order to get jurisdiction. So, ever heard the expression, hoist on his own petard? That's what happened. Well, anyway, to make a really long story short, the book that I wrote details this, but many of the other details that we learned came later when we launched a campaign. Well, first looked into the histories of these people and whether it was possible to get a pardon for these people posthumously in Montana, despite the fact that nobody had ever been pardoned before. And we were asking for 78 pardons. Well, we were fortunate to have Governor Schweitzer as governor. And Schweitzer's background was from a German-Russian family that had settled in Montana, and he was well aware of the discrimination against Germans during World War I, including against some of the people that he knew about. And so he was willing to lend his hand and grant these pardons. So on May 6th, 2008, we had a pardon ceremony in Helena in the Rotunda, to which families of these deceased people came from all over the country to sort of bring closure to this event that they didn't know that in some cases they knew that their relatives had gone to jail, but they didn't know why. And it turned out that these people had been convicted of the crime of speech. So basically, that's what this book is about. And I'm going to end my talk there. But I do want to say that just in conclusion. So in these very tumultuous times, the first quarter of the 20th century. First quarter of the 20th century. Tumultuous times in the 21st century too, but anyway. Socialists made their impact on Montana, the U.S., and the world, encountering many obstacles along the way, and finally nearly succumbing to war hysteria, the Red Scares, and the laws arrayed against them. But their losses in court and the sedition convictions of Montanans and Americans throughout the Espionage Act eventually led to a strengthened freedom of expression. The many examples of their brave struggles in the courts, in the streets, in the factories and mines and fields should serve as an inspiration to a new generation of socialists. Thank you.
I believe we're going to do a quick Q&A now. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll do our best to get a microphone to you.
Switching to the 21st century.
Sorry, I think
Oh,
maybe.
sorry. Well, let's take her first.
I just have a quick question. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. You touched on this a little bit, but I'm hoping for just like a little summary of why people conflate communism with socialism, because that's driving me bonkers.
Why they combined the two? Why they conflated them? Yeah. That was just a. Why did people conflate socialism and communism? They were both perceived by the popular press and by thought leaders in the establishment to be one and the same. And many people believed that and didn't bother to get into the details of why they were different. And socialists were associated with acts of violence and disobedience and whatever. I'm sure there's a more detailed explanation, but that's the bottom line. Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, switching to the 21st century, and this has been called the age of information. The last few years, you could call it the age of disinformation. With your background in journalism, with freedom of expression, how do we counter disinformation?
Yes, well, that's the billion-dollar question. Disinformation is spread through a fractured media environment that we can't even really call media, a fractured information environment. that includes so many channels and platforms that that allow people to spread lies and disinformation. And because it is so widespread and fractured, it is that much more difficult to discount or to counter. It's in a way sort of like whack-a-mole, or if you go to try to counter one form or one particular lie, it will spread somewhere else. So at least that is a very basically top line answer to that question. It's just the fracturing of the messages and the platforms of communication.
That's a description. You have a solution.
No.
Actually, I got a question about the Missoula free speech fight, but just before I ask that question, I want to make sure everybody knows there is a Stand Up for Science rally on the University Oval tomorrow at noon, because the people are losing grants are being cut off. People are being threatened with arrest if they talk about DEI and terrible things like environmental justice and things of that sort. So I hope you, if you can do so, if you come to the University Oval tomorrow at noon and take part in that stand up for, for free speech for university people. Also, if one rally is not enough for you, on Sunday there's a public land rally that'll be at McCormick Park. My question about the free speech fight in Missoula, it's a minor one, but it's one of my favorite stories, so I want to make sure I've got it right. And you indicated that after they filled up the jail, Missoula repealed its speech ban, and then they went on to Spokane, where they filled up the jail, and they repealed their speech ban and also took away the license of the scam employment agency.
Yes.
And so I wonder if they did that in Missoula too, took away the license of the scam employment agency.
I don't think so. I've never seen anything about that in Missoula. They may have, or maybe it was enough to sort of scare off the scam artists for a while. I don't know. Yeah.
Hi, I mean, this isn't so much a question, but I guess sort of an answer to your what do we do for the 21st century. The IWW is still around. Hi, I'm Hallie. I'm with the Wobblies.
Hallie, I didn't mean to suggest that the IWW is
Oh,
not,
no, don't worry
not
about
around.
it. Oh, no, Brendan just invited me to promo the Wobblies, so blame your son. But we're still around. Honestly, actively recruiting. We could definitely use a ton of help if you want the Wobblies to continue being around, especially with the threats to the NLRB. We might need a hell of a lot of really radical solidarity unionism soon. So MissoulaIWW@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram. You can come talk to me after and I'll hook you up. We're also working on recruiting for an organizer training 101 if you want to learn how to organize your workplace without a contract. And I can speak personally, I've found that training very applicable to a lot of things, like a lot of organizing outside of the IWW. So that's my plug. Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks, Hallie.
Thank you so much for your information. I learned some things here that I didn't know. I love the book Big Trouble. A lot of people know about his defense of Clarence Darrow, but they don't really know about the connection of socialism and defending free speech. And I'm really glad you mentioned that book. And I just wanted to also mention there's a podcast called Death in the West that I don't know if anybody here has listened to it, that talks about what happened to Frank Little. And it's an incredible podcast, and I just wanted to mention that if anyone's interested in it. Yeah. The question I have, and I never connected the dots with Montana's Sedition Act and some of the cultural legacy that we have in Montana of not necessarily showing our cards about who we are politically, because we get backlash for that. And also there's a huge cultural tradition in Montana not to speak out against war. And I'm wondering if that's the legacy of some of the propaganda that people were exposed to generations ago. I know my family doesn't speak out against the war at all. And I'm wondering what that legacy has left us today. Thank you.
Well, I do know that it affected the German community a lot. And the German community's response in general was to try to assimilate more rather than to speak out more. Not everybody, but that was the general response. But they also tried to sort of shed some of the traditional symbols of their language and culture and stop speaking German and stop playing Beethoven maybe. I don't know, just various things that they just sort of tried to go dark, which was a shame. I don't know whether that affected other communities in Montana or whether that's just plain old Montana taciturn.
I think it's impacted our culture.
Yeah.
We are in part taciturn because of the Sedition Act as well.
Could be.
Thanks for your talk. I'm curious if you're familiar with the book, The Red Corner. I read it a few years ago, and it highlights the growth of communism and socialism in the northeast corner of Montana in Sheridan County. I seem to recall from that book that there was a state senator who was sent to Helena from Sheridan that was actually a member of the Communist Party in the 1920s. And then they all got very involved in the Farmer Labor Party after that. Could you talk about the Farmer Labor Party, socialism in northeast Montana?
Well, a little bit. The Farmer Labor Party originated in North Dakota and also had actually similar branches in Canada. But they were concerned about the way that farmers were being treated and about social issues, and adopted a platform that was actually quite similar to communism. And the influence of that led to Roosevelt County briefly being led by communists. But I don't really know much more about the eventual or how long that. All I know is it was fairly brief, but still pretty startling that they were, communist politicians in charge of a county in Montana at one time.
Hi. I had a question about the case that involved the man being kidnapped. I was curious if in the writings you say that the ability to transfer venue didn't exist at the time. I'm curious about the rules around personal jurisdiction, because generally a court can't get personal jurisdiction over someone if they're brought into the jurisdiction by force. Then you said he was kidnapped. So I'm curious if in the writings the court just glosses over all of these major jurisdictional issues and just illegally proceeds with the case.
I don't know. There might have been a little contribution to the judge's favorite fund. I'm just speculating, of course, but yes, the judge basically ignored that in that case. Yeah.
Hi. I know that in the 1890s there was a third party called the Populist Party with a capital P that did have a presence in Montana, and they were a more left leaning form of populism. Can you speak to how that movement interacted with the socialist ideologies in Montana at the time at all?
Well, the Populist Party had gotten started in the 1870s, 1880s, and was pretty well established, and there were a fair number of members in Montana. When the Socialist Party came along, I think that the populists felt like they were being co-opted, and there was a fair amount of animosity between the two groups. Or maybe it flowed more, the animosity flowed more from the populists to the socialists, who quickly gained strength and popularity, and in effect kind of pushed the populists out of the limelight, out of the spotlight anyway. So it wasn't a very friendly, cooperative relationship.
In regard to these laws and rights afforded to the people, to what extent do they matter when they are so easily swept aside? And what is an avenue to find a solution to such a problem?
When laws are set aside so easily,
Yes.
sounds like you're talking about a present-day problem, but I'm saying that only partially in jest. I think that the solution at that time was through publicity, through the press, through some forms of political action that were maybe directed against the judiciary, that maybe were more effective in those days. I don't know. Perhaps there was greater outrage about laws being set aside. I don't really know. Yes, Robbie.
So two things. First, just thanks for bringing up the Free Speech Corner downtown. There's, as some of you may know, there's a plaque on Front and Main. The corner of Front and Higgins, commemorating the free speech fights that the Wobblies helped put up about 15 years ago. In any case, I wanted to perhaps address the question that you just had about like what happens when we have rights. Are they really rights if they're put aside so easily? And I think if you ask someone like Howard Zinn, who would say that rights only exist to the extent that you preserve them, that you exercise them. And I think that's in some ways part of why we have DSA, why we have a socialist movement going on right now, is to assert those rights and to preserve those rights, as well as to work for a structure, a system where those rights are never in question. And because the groups who would take away those rights are the groups with power. The capitalists, as we all know, are the ones who would remove those rights. And so if we can remove the capitalists, then our rights will be more likely to be preserved. So that's my 2 cents there.
Thanks, Robbie, and your answer was a hell of a lot better than mine. Yeah.
My great-grandmother was German, right from Germany, and in the 40s, she sold flowers at the farmer's market, but she was investigated because she got the German newspaper. This was a little town outside of Buffalo, New York. So I imagine there were a lot more people investigated than the 78 people that were convicted. Do you have any idea on that? And that's got to throw a scare into people too, even just being investigated to shut them up.
Well, yes, if you were German, you were automatically suspect during that time of war hysteria. Another case that I didn't bring up was the beer hall Germans in Helena. Germans love beer. They worked and established a lot of saloons in places like Helena. So the government decided, okay, we're going to get some of these people. And the way we're going to do it is, we're going to send in a spy, a guy named Eberhard von Waldrau, with a very sketchy background, was employed by the government to go into the beer halls, engage the workers in German, and essentially trap them with leading questions and then take notes on what they said and then report it to the government that he worked, or basically, yeah, the state government. And that's how they were basically charged with sedition. A whole bunch of guys who were just Germans and had, German ideas, but sure they were against the war, but there was nothing else to it. Yeah, kept you guys long enough.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Do you believe that there will ever be a third party, socialist party? And what are the chances here in the United States? Like a real party where it can maybe be elected?
Yeah, my crystal ball is not working. But all I can say is I hope so. Okay, we've seen over and over the failures of the elected party, of the major parties. There are obviously many obstacles electorally, legally, in the electoral process and so forth that encourage, a two-party system. But then on the other hand, there's, enthusiasm and righteous anger that is growing, and I hope that will build into a viable third party. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so books for $20. If you haven't signed in, please do. We have a bunch of literature up here and stickers and buttons. Also programs based off of what DSA does. So please grab something on your way out. We have upcoming flyers, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks.